The consequences were enormous. There were miracles of healing. Many Muslims were converted. But the really interesting thing was that the prime minister of Egypt was so convinced that in the aftermath, the government bought the real estate opposite the church, knocked it all down, and built a cathedral in her honor.
G'day everyone, welcome to the Thomas More Centre channel. My name is Mark Makievsky, and today it's my pleasure to be interviewing Dr. Gavin Ashenden. Gavin, welcome to the channel.
Mark, thank you.
So Gavin, I understand you're joining me from France. I didn't understand you spent your time between England and France. Do you want to kind of tell us what you do, how you split your time?
Yes, once upon a time, I was working as a parish priest in Jersey, and I thought I'd stay there for a long time. And so I bought a home quite close by, about an hour away, near Mont Saint-Michel. And so I have a small house near my parents-in-law in the middle of the country, and I've kept this wonderful little mill house where I come and write, and it has a chapel in the grounds. And the reason it's very special is that it was built or renewed by a Catholic philanthropist who used to run an alcohol center in Paris, and he would bring some of his clients down here, and he built a chapel and a greenhouse as a place of healing and recuperation. And so to some extent, I feel like a steward of a rather holy place. It's got a sense of sanctity about it. So I come here to write and to pray.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. So I thought we'd jump right into it because you're fairly well known, but there are some aspects of your life that I suppose are less commented upon. It's been remarked in several places that while you were studying for the Anglican priesthood, you were seconded to a Greek Orthodox monastery, and that had a profound impact on your spirituality. I was wondering if you could share some more about that with us.
Yes, I trained at the most evangelical and Protestant seminary or theological college the Church of England has. But I could equally have gone, I was thinking of going to a monastic one in the north. I was not naturally of any particular churchmanship. It's just that when I converted to Christianity as a law student in a moment of crisis, I said to God, what kind of Christian do you want me to be? Do you want me to be a Pentecostal, a Catholic, an Anglican? I've no idea. And I found myself in the way that we find God guides us through circumstances usually. I found myself as an Anglican training at an evangelical college, which I didn't really belong to. I loved the people there. And I loved their commitment. But I didn't have the Protestant presuppositions that they had. And so at one point, by accident, I was seconded, because I was supposed to go somewhere else originally, but I was seconded to a Greek Orthodox monastery. And as soon as I got there, I said, my goodness, this is the kind of Christianity my bones cry out for. And there were some monks there I got to know. They taught me about hesychastic prayer, and I loved the liturgy. I loved the Eucharist, and it made evangelical Anglicanism seem very, well, if I say kindergartenish, what I mean is I don't mean infantile, but I mean underdeveloped. And I went back simply thinking, well, I'm really Catholic or Orthodox. However, God's put me here, so let's just go on with the journey as it is. And as I was ordained and then became a parish priest, I found myself drawn to the Little Brothers of Jesus, following Charles Foucault. We met in front of the Blessed Sacrament once a month. We didn't take communion together, but we certainly prayed in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And so, and then I did some postgraduate work in psychology with the Jesuits. So Catholicism kept on bubbling up through my daily circumstances. And was it Kierkegaard? It was who said we have to live life forwards, but only understand it looking backwards. So living it forwards, I didn't make much sense of it. But looking backwards now, I can see that God was preparing me to become a Catholic, even if it took 40 years to do it.
Yeah, and you had in terms of your academic training, you did your doctorate on Charles Williams, who was one of the more minor members of C.S. Lewis's Inklings. Can you tell us what interested you about Williams and what I suppose, his greatest literary contribution has been, in your opinion?
Well, I can certainly tell you what it was for me. I was in a bookshop in Brighton and I picked up a book called The Descent of the Dove. I'd never heard of Charles Williams. I opened it in the middle and began to speed read. And then I had to stop speed reading because it was just extraordinary. I'd never seen theological writing like it. And I think I have a particular weakness for Pentecostalism, or at least for the hunger for the renewing Holy Spirit. And in this book, I found Catholic spirituality infused with a kind of something between mysticism and Pentecostalism. But it was unique. And it was a history of the church. And I bought it and went away and devoured it. And I thought, I simply want to look through this man's eyes. I've never seen anything like it. And one of the things he did theologically was to find a way of, well, what he called, it's an ancient Greek theological term called coherence and perichoresis, the interpenetration of opposites. In outside Christianity, Jung does it. Inside Christianity, the church fathers do it well. And there's this notion of the interplay between complementary aspects of our life. You could say male and female would be one example in the present culture wars. But in this case, it was the via negativa and the via positiva. It was, if you like, the Christianity of renunciation and Christianity of celebration, the Christianity of spirit, the Christianity of sanctified matter. And usually what happens is, Christian spirituality lurches from one to the other. And what Williams was making a case for the integrated journey of both. And again, I hadn't seen this really anywhere. I was very aware that the European spirituality was much dominated by the via negativa, partly because the stamp of monasticism is deepest. But one of the things Williams did was to introduce me to Dante. And Dante and Williams themselves are poets of the via affirmativa. They look at love, life, dancing, eating, drinking, the sort of the energetic, acrobatic versatility of living in the body, not for the sake of license, but for the sake of celebrating the incarnation. And one of the things both he and Dante did was to deal with the notion of romantic love. And I'd been very struck by the way in which Hollywood seemed to have set a dominant spirituality, which was romantic and erotic, in which people were encouraged to fall in love with somebody and to find, as if they're the person they first met. But then when it failed, they would do it again and again and again and again. And one of the things that both Williams and Dante did was to suggest that that this was the wrong approach. Williams had this wonderful notion that when you fall in love, you're in the middle for a moment of a gifted mystic experience, and you see the beloved as God sees them, unbelievably precious and almost without fault, and you'll do anything for them. And what he suggests is that this is a vision that our Lord gives us, and from the moment we look through his eyes, and if we marry that person, it's our duty to so love them that everybody else gets to see them like that in time, a sort of a vision that we become the realizators, along with the Holy Spirit, of how wonderful and precious this person is through the eyes of love. And again, this was really unusual. And I thought it could be a very profound way of mending the bridge between Christianity's monastically driven suspicion of the romantic and to some extent the erotic, and the addiction of secular society to it. And so Williams and Dante, it seemed to me, both threw a bridge across, and that was a matter of some interest.
If people are interested in reading more, you published a book. Is that still in print?
Oh yes, just about, probably.
Okay.
Yes, it is. Yes, it's but it's a book that does more than that. One of the things I quickly discovered was that there had been at this point you have to stop me or I can launch off into long lectures. But there'd been a very interesting movement in the 19th century called the Golden Dawn, which had at one end occultists like the dreadful Aleister Crowley, and at other ends mystics like Evelyn Underhill, and in the middle, W.B. Yeats. I mean, Yeats swung both ways, really. He couldn't quite make up his mind between pagan mysticism and Christian mysticism. But in this group was a man called A.E. Waite, and A.E. Waite, and there was a kind of breakaway of Christians to Christianize mysticism rather than paganize it. And he started a new organization called the Rosy Cross, a kind of neo-Rosicrucian organization. Williams got involved in it, and quite clearly Williams was sort of unhygienically attracted to magic, which was the, if you like, the underbelly of this complex group. But a number of people who hadn't really taken the trouble to find out thought that Williams had probably become tainted by the occult. Now, to some small extent, he might have done, but equally, what he had done is to take esotericism and mysticism and relocate it deeply into the Christian tradition, Christianize it, which then became a form of mystical, in the best sense, not in the kind of Gnostic sense, a mystical awareness. And one of the things I wanted to do, because I thought he was saying so many important things about the theology of romantic love, about the via negativa and positiva, about perichoresis, I wanted to give him a clean bill of theological health. And so I went looking to see to what extent he might have been corrupted by the occult. And I wrote a book saying, he's fine, guys. I mean, one of the things I did was to go through his novels, and I thought to demonstrate a kind of fairly primitive, unhealthy interest at the beginning, which matured into very profound Christian writing at the end. One of his novels involves two academics getting involved in a kind of intellectual bitch fight for the whole of their lives. It's sort of trapped in and what happened was my doctoral supervisor, who was a professor of English, said to me, he said, "This is a great work, but one of us needs to write the ultimate biography." And I said, "Well, I'm not pedantic enough. I'm not a biographer. I deal with a large scale." He said, "Well, I'll do it then, and I'll incorporate your work." And he was a Buddhist, and I swear he didn't get either the occult or Christian mysticism, and he undid all my work. And in this new, he was a Buddhist who was extremely interested in drug taking and hedonistic culture. And I just think he didn't get Williams at all, theologically and spiritually. So he wrote the definitive book, which repudiated mine. And I then thought, well, I've got to write the answer. No, this is what Williams warned against. I'll spend my life in this intellectual bitch fight with this man, or each of us producing book after book, locked in I'm going to leave it. I've done what I came here to do. People will have to judge what I've written on its merits.
Very good. So you've been Catholic for going on 5 years.
Formerly Catholic, yes.
Formerly Catholic, yes. But you've said that since you've become Catholic in the formal sense, you've come to see the English Reformation in a whole new light. I was wondering if you could enlighten us on what's changed for you.
Well, it's quite a long story in a sense. I remember it began in two places. It began when I picked up a book of the history of England, exploring propaganda. And one of the things it did was to look at the way in which the government had provided us with pro-government propaganda from the 16th century. And an example of this was the way in which some of the reports into the monasteries were written in advance by Cromwell's agents. In other words, we're sold the whole project that they were a mixed bag, they needed reforming, it was no bad thing, they should be reformed, their situation was worse than it was, but actually it was a cynical land grab by the crown, and almost certainly the reports were not even, well, they were certainly not even-handed, and some of them were written beforehand. And this led on to looking at the way in which the English state had presented its own interests as part of the history that my generation had learned. So I began to wonder where else I needed to revisit history. And just at that point, I went in to pray in Westminster Cathedral, and I stumbled across the body of St. John Southwold, I think, preserved in a coffin, and went away. you literally bumped into him as you came into the cathedral on the way to the Blessed Sacrament. And I thought, well, who is this man? And I went to look him up, and I was astonished at his courage and bravery as a Catholic priest. And then I began to wonder why it was that Catholic priests were dealt with so horrendously brutally. And of course, the official position was that this was a political matter, that we were, the crown was worried about Spain and France, and these people were potentially agents. But then when you began to read their own writing, they all came with disclaimers saying, we support the Queen, we support the crown, we have no interest whatsoever in being political subversives. We just want to celebrate the Mass. Now, they knew that, and the crown knew that, but the crown nonetheless chose to present them as political traitors and to kill them ruthlessly. And so then the question is, well, what was the crown so afraid of? And the answer was, it was afraid of the Mass. And then, if you, as I looked at that and the way in which Catholicism was brutally suppressed and Catholics were kept out of all public life, this was effectively a form of Catholicophobia. So why? What lay behind it? And then at some point I became convinced that Shakespeare was a Catholic. A couple of really excellent books, and the reason, essentially, the reason for that is the silence. Only somebody who wanted to keep out of the hands of the punitive states. So, for example, if you didn't go to the local Anglican church on a Sunday, they could fine you, well, the equivalent of 30,000 English pounds, a year's salary for a teacher. I mean, just the most enormously ruinous sums. They weren't playing around. And what Shakespeare did was, apart from to present the human condition in a philosophically neutral form so brilliantly by getting under the skin of all kinds of different people, he managed to hide his Catholicism, though nonetheless embedding his 16th century Christian humanism in a Catholic framework with immense subtlety. And one of the reasons I became convinced that he was a Catholic was, for example, one of the last purchases he bought was a building called Blackfriars in London, where Catholic recusants would go 200 or 300 on a Sunday to celebrate Mass. And he had to know what was going on there. And he bought it to protect them. And we only know this because it collapsed about a few decades after his death, killing 200 or 300 people who were at Mass. And then it came out, this was the place in London where recusants gathered. And Shakespeare had been the person who had made sure that they could. Well, this was not the act of a neutral agnostic or a nominal Anglican. And then there are a number of other hidden clues in his plays. But so began a long journey of the reconfiguration of the antipathy of the English state towards the Catholic Church. And then there was a journey into knowing Mary and the journey into understanding Eucharistic miracles. And as I began to understand Eucharistic miracles, mainly through looking at the one in Buenos Aires in '94, I then began to get a sense that what the English state hated most of all was the Mass. It was terrified of the Mass and those who would offer the sacrifice of the Mass. And this was not a political ploy at all. It was a profound metaphysical conflict in which the state had treated Catholicism with a degree of brutality that the Soviet gulags would have been proud of. And so I then, and one of the things this did was to make Anglicanism is a hybrid political venture with ecumenical pretensions. And if you look at it benignly, then you see something undogmatically useful. All it has is the 39 articles. But having said that, they're profoundly anti-Catholic. I mean, they deny the Mass, they deny the Pope, they deny tradition. I mean, they say stupid things like we're bound by the councils of the Church, the early ecumenical councils, except where we're not. And I don't tell you why they're not or where they're not. It was just, which is it's almost puerile in its stupidity. But it's what it represents, which is important, which was an independent reconstruction of Christianity along Protestant lines, trying to draw together people across the widest political spectrum to allow for Elizabethan political stability. But the one thing it did was to hate the Mass. So it took over the buildings, it took over some of the clothes, it took over some of the language, but it was ruthlessly antipathetic towards the theology of the Mass and the theology of the Catholic Church. And there were moments when, and so this then changed to some extent with the Oxford movement. And then the Oxford movement divided into two types of people, Newman and Pusey. And so Newman, rather playfully and skittishly, reinterpreted the 39 Articles by playing around with the over colourful adjectives and winning it in debating points. But he infuriated people when they discovered that the debate could be won from a Catholic point of view, and that the skids had been put under this profoundly antithetic document. They were absolutely livid. And he then realized that although he'd been playing a game of some kind, it was more serious than that. And that there wasn't any way at all in which what I think I describe as the sacramental nostalgia for the Mass, which I think lay in the hearts of the British people, unconsciously, unknown, under the ground. Every so often, the ground got broken up. The Wesleys were profoundly nostalgic for the Mass and began as quasi-high church Anglicans. The Oxford movement was an expression of the same thing. When he realized that actually Anglicanism was just playing at this, it meant something much more brutally antithetic. He converted. Meanwhile, there were a lot of other people who were equally nostalgic for the Mass, like Pusey, and they stayed, saying, well, we can change the Church of England. We can make it more Catholic, which, if I'm right in suggesting that its genesis was built on a anti-Catholic, anti-Mass basis, was never going to happen, and it didn't ever happen. In fact, what happened was that the Church of England began to embrace wokery and cultural relativism with enormous speed, and when it, for example, accepted contraception in the 1930s. It was an early and devastating blow to Catholic theology of sexuality and the body, and it unraveled very fast from that point onwards. So lots of my friends say, Gavin, you've become bitter and vengeful. And actually, after I converted, I remember seeing a YouTube interview with a lovely old Anglican priest who said, I've become a Catholic, but I'm so grateful for Anglicanism. I will never slag it off. I will always just be grateful how benign it was and it found my way here. And I decided to copy him. I thought, this sounds so lovely and so gracious. This is quite clearly a winsome thing to do. But as I began to read history in a different way, I thought, but this isn't true. It's actually a decoy. It's intended to stop people getting to the church, just to give people fake sacraments, to give them placebos, and for as long as it does that, they're not going to come to the Mass. This is a dreadfully offensive venture, and so I've been saying so because I am deeply offended by it. And I keep on saying to people, look, if you want to be Catholic, you just come to the Mass, come to Our Lady, come to our Holy Father in Rome. If you're serious, you just have to become Catholic, but you'll pay a price for it. But they don't want to pay the price. The price, in the first place, is submission to the Protestant spirit, submission of a kind of independence. I get to choose my spirituality. I get to choose how I relate to the Church. The painful and glorious thing about becoming a Catholic is you don't at all. You just submit, sign up, and become a penitent Mass goer. And the rest is largely done for you to some extent. But the cost of this surrender of independence is much too much for many of them. And they want to go on having the privilege of pretending to be Catholic, aping Catholic spirituality, thus sating to some extent the valid sacramental longing they have, but unwilling to sacrifice themselves for it.
Yeah, Pope Benedict, he kind of created a bridge, didn't he, with the ordinariate when he allowed kind of Anglicans who are attached to the patrimony to come along. And I'm particularly grateful for that. I've only been to a couple of ordinariate masses, but I've always had a fondness for Anglican hymns. I was just wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on the ordinariate and how that's going and things like that.
I'm a passionate supporter of it. Like you, I think it's completely wonderful. I think it's a genius idea because despite all the things I said, there are some very beautiful things in Anglicanism. the Holy Spirit kept on trying to break through both from the evangelical and the Catholic end, and lots of people responded as best they could, not knowing they were in a straitjacket. But as you say, the hymns are beautiful. Hymns and poetry are of a high quality, as is the liturgy. And although Cranmer was a naughty man, he was a very talented naughty man. he produced the most wonderful liturgy at the high point of English grammar and literacy. It's been going downhill ever since. Progress is an illusion. I rather think that probably the 15th century was maybe in the apex, the highest point of all human civilization. But in Anglican terms, the Cranmer's work was just wonderful, and it was very generous of Pope Benedict to allow this fusion, because there are things in the Catholic Church that are not well done. The translation of the Bible is often not well done, particularly the Psalms. The liturgy is often not well done. Tolkien complained a great deal about this. There are a number of literary competent people who say, well, but it could be done better and should be. So I think the Ordinariat is a really wonderful synthesis of everything, and I wish it well. I joined it at one point, but I suffered from a small political bit of infighting, which meant that I had to withdraw myself in order not to get drawn more deeply into this infighting. But nothing in that withdrawal stops me admiring it and loving it and supporting it.
You said before that kind of part of what was in Anglicanism was a fear of the Mass, and you've said that you've had some personal spiritual battles, let's say, and one of them involves the Mass.
Yes.
In particular, in a church in southwest France. I was wondering whether you could expand upon that episode and talk about the power of the Eucharist in what it did.
It was very strange. This will sound a bit weird to people, so I apologize, but I can't change history or what happened. I had become, I'm ashamed to say I had become a Jungian. That there are good reasons for that. I'll try and keep this as concrete as I can. I worked for 25 years in our most radical university as a lecturer in the psychology of religion. And in the first half, my ideological enemies were all Freudians. And one of the great things about Jung was that in psychological terms, he disagreed profoundly with Freud and made a case for spirituality as being absolutely essential for mental health, whereas Freud saw it as highly detrimental. So he was an ally, and he produced a really excellent map of the human unconscious. And once again, individuation, and you'll see how this ties in with Charles Williams. Individuation was the perichoresis, the integration of consciousness and unconsciousness. And he suggested that spirituality, religion, was the best route to achieve it. So he's a very, very close fellow traveler of great use in certain contexts. However, I'd been frightened off the charismatic movement to some extent by having to deal with mental illness very close up. Not my own. My own has never broken out into the public sphere, though I don't think any of us are mentally well. But nonetheless, the difficulty, there is an overlap between the demonic and between mental illness that is profoundly complex and extremely difficult to unravel. And I solved it by just running away and saying, I can't cope with this. I'm going to ignore the demonic, which was a terrible thing to do, because my sort of first 5 or 7 years as a Christian were peppered with struggles with the devil. Now, some people will think that's a bit odd, but well, then it was odd. I didn't look for it. But there's a kind of journey out beyond. Our Lord says, lead us not into temptation and deliver us from the evil one. And then, the wretched translators have taken out the evil one and made it generic evil. And there's a kind of dilution of our apprehension of evil into a kind of general force. And, it gets most perverse in Jung when he describes it as a shadow. but there's a kind of journey away from the full recognition of having to deal with evil, which is part of a degradation of spirituality. And yet, the task of dealing with evil is one of the primary ones in the Christian life, because the moment we ate the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, discernment became our one weapon to make our way through what was going to become the privileges of having entered into the world of moral choice in all its complexity. And so I took the easy route out, and I became a Jungian, and the devil ruined it by revisiting me in about 2000 between 2005 and 2008, unlooked for. And one of those occasions was in Le Puy, which is a very special place. It's one of the places one begins the pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela at, and Our Lady appeared there really in the first century, quite early. And I'd taken a group of an ecumenical pilgrimage to Thésée, and I decided to give myself a week of praying in Le Puy afterwards. And the whole thing became extremely strange. So, for example, after I'd pitched my tent in the campsite underneath the foot of a chapel dedicated to St. Michael on a kind of stalactite. I get stalagmites and stalactites mixed up, so people will have to forgive me. But anyway, it's a wonderful, huge mound. And I went in to walk in the town, and the architecture in this town in France involves roofs stretching right out over the pavements or sidewalks by about sort of 4 or 5 feet. They're quite ornate, and they give cover from rain and sun. And I walked along. There was a Catholic priest coming towards me, and one's always interested in other clergy. You kind of, I like looking into people's eyes and seeing what's going on there. a bit of spiritual voyeurism. And then this interesting guy, I was just dressed as a tourist. We caught glances, we kind of nodded at each other, and we passed on. And then we'd gone about 25 feet past each other, and suddenly the whole roof above us collapsed about 50 feet. Tons of masonry just falling down where we'd been and where we'd crossed. And we both stopped, shocked, turned around and looked at each other across this sea of tiles and twisted. So, and 2, 3, 4 seconds later, we'd both been under it and killed. And so, we kind of looked, walked on. What else do you do? But I thought, well, that was a very strange thing to happen. I was within seconds. He and I were within seconds of being killed, but we escaped by a few inches. That's odd. The following day, Mass is celebrated on Wednesdays in this chapel of St. Michael, and I turned up. And again, I have to apologize to Pope Benedict and apologize to all Catholics. Like many Anglicans, I decided I was qualified to take Mass if I chose to. I'm sorry about that. So I went there to take Mass, thinking myself an Anglican Catholic, a Catholic Anglican. And something very strange happened. So first of all, I met the priest, celebrating priest on the way up. Again, I looked at him, and he had very good eyes, I remember. And I thought, I'm a little bit of a Donatist. And I thought, this will be a good Mass. The priest is good. It'll be good Mass. And I went up there, and it's a very, very atmospheric place. And as he began the liturgy, something terrible happened. I thought I'd had a stroke. I couldn't hear or see straight. And I didn't know what on earth it was, except that suddenly there were a whole load of dark bat-like creatures circling above my head like a whirlpool. And then the whirlpool turned into a kind of whirlpool, and they began to dive bomb me. And I kind of wanted to look around to see if anybody else was freaked out. But my senses weren't all working, and I couldn't tell. But the trouble is, they dive bombed me with horror. So it didn't hit me, but they came carrying despair, guilt, and hopelessness. It's very, very hard to explain. I wanted to run out screaming, but I wasn't entirely in possession of my body. However, the theological sort of cameraman in the back of my head said, well, this is quite interesting, however. What are they doing here in this chapel, a very holy place, a holy town, dedicated to St. Michael in the middle of the Holy Mass. They have no business to be here. They must be here on some kind of license, but at what point is that license withdrawn? What's going on here? And it will be very interesting to see if this dive bombing survives the epiclesis, as so spirits invoke, and it did. They went on, and then I thought, well, there'll be the elevation. Surely that will put an end to it. And then the host was elevated, and it didn't. And then, completely bemused and not exactly in my right mind, I went forward to take the mass, and the moment the mass, I received in the hand, which I no longer do, of course. And the moment the host touched my tongue, it was like someone had flicked a switch, and the whole thing just was turned off. And I mean, I'm afraid I don't have any profound theological insight apart from it was Jesus touching my tongue that did it. Well, that's just it. There's nothing more or less to it. Why they should have come for me then and there, I didn't know. But I just thought, well, that's this really is the food of immortality. This really is the antidote to the enemy. This is fantastic. And I suppose I began to ask myself whether this would have happened if I celebrated or in an Anglican church. But the thing about crises is, on the whole, one doesn't tend to deal with them until one's absolutely forced to. So I didn't really know what to make of this. But as it happened, I don't know, about a year later, I found myself assaulted between the hours of 1 and 5 in the morning by demons in my bed, and I went 3 days without sleep. Consulted a friend of mine who was a Catholic diocesan exorcist. After the first night, I started going mad. Or is this what it looks like? No, he said, it's what it looks like. What do I do? You pray the rosary. Well, I know quite a lot about Mariology. I know about our Marian devotion in the Middle Ages, but and this will sound a bit odd, but like so many Anglicans, I picked and chose. And I said, well, I don't actually pray the rosary. Now, I mean, many Anglicans do, but I didn't. And I hadn't worked out my relationship with Our Lady, apart from I wanted to know a lot about her. I said, I'm not quite sure I'm ready to pray the rosary. Well, lad, he said, he was from Yorkshire. He said, you got the choice. It's either the demons in hell or it's Our Lady. You can choose between them. And so that night I prayed the rosary. And it had although they took 2 nights to go away, the moment I started praying the rosary had the most profound effect. And at the end of it all, in a room where the windows were closed in early spring, the room was full of the scent of roses. And so there was a lot of theological information to be digested at that point. But the point came where I believed in the Mass. I spent some time looking at Our Lady's apparitions, and about that time I'd been in Zaytun in Egypt on pilgrimage, and stood on the Church of the Nativity, and opposite it is this huge cathedral that's not quite finished. And I said to our guide, how does downtown Cairo happen to have a huge cathedral next to this very ancient church, which tradition says is on the place where the Holy Family stayed? And he said, oh, well, because of Our Lady of Zaytun. Now, not the people listening to this may not know, but in 1968, Our Lady appeared in Cairo, just before the Six-Day War, a time of immense political danger. For 6 months, she didn't say anything. But there are lots of pictures of her silhouette hovering over the church. Over 500,000 people would have seen it. The consequences were enormous. There were miracles of healing. Many Muslims were converted. But the really interesting thing was that the Prime Minister of Egypt, President Nasser, who was a secularized Muslim, was so convinced that in the aftermath, the government bought the real estate opposite the church, knocked it all down, and at the state's expense built a cathedral in her honor. So if the secular Islamist state of Egypt thought the apparitions in Zaytun were real, then maybe I could cut them a bit of slack. And I particularly looked at the ones of Garabandal, and Garabandal, Fatima wasn't easily accessible to me for a number of reasons. But I looked at Garabandal and became, again, quite convinced, with the help of a child psychologist I worked with at the university, as we looked at the body language of the children, that it was authentic. So soon all the pieces of the jigsaw were in place. I loved Our Lady. I prayed the Rosary. I believed in the sacrifice of the Mass in the most profound sense. I I was worried about Francis because I thought he was an Anglican, and also I had a job to do. I'd accepted a responsibility of trying. I was consecrated as a missionary bishop by some traditionalist Anglicans, with the responsibility of trying to arrange a kind of fifth column recovery Catholic Anglicanism for when the Church of England failed. And I'd been doing that a few years and discovered the next important stage was that without a magisterium, what I was trying to do was completely impossible. And the only church that had the magisterium was the Catholic Church. So magisterium, Our Lady, the Holy Mass. I just had to. I just had to get over my difficulties that the incumbent of the See of St. Peter may have been more Anglican than I was.
Yeah. There is an interesting thing happening with quite a few notable personalities becoming Catholic, and I'm wondering whether this is God's way of trying to raise up prophets, you might say, who are actually willing to speak and to speak their mind. So I've got some questions in that regard coming up. Yeah, go ahead.
Before you do, can I just say I think that's exactly right. So, one of the things I was on General Synod of the Church of England for 20 years. I know all about synodality. I know what it does. I know what it's intended to do. I know I've spent 20 years or more, 30, 40 years, exploring the issues of the ordination of women and the theology of the masculine and the feminine. Not that there was any theology in the Anglican journey, it was all politics, but that in itself is a discovery. And so I come to Catholicism as a refuge against the theological corrosion of liberalism, only to discover that, that if you like, the church is just beginning to go down the same route that I happen to know is absolutely disastrous. I know it is disastrous. I know why it's disastrous, and I can explain it. And I'm absolutely not going to come into the church and sit on my backside and say, "Oh well, folks, good luck with what you've got coming down the road. You won't like it." So there's no doubt at all. I feel a responsibility. I don't think it's egotism. I mean, obviously one has to watch one's ego and constantly repent and fall flat on one's face before the Lord. But I do feel I know about this stuff theologically, politically, sociologically, metaphysically, psychologically. I know about it. So it would be a dereliction of responsibility to keep quiet.
Yeah. Well, I get the sense that like Catholic Unscripted, Ashenden Unscripted, it hits at the parish level. My folks, g'day, my folks will watch this, and a number of other people who are just very loyal Catholics in the pews and suffering are coming to people, your voice and voices like yours, because they're desperate for someone to actually to speak the faith in a straightforward, clear manner that's unapologetic. So no, good on you.
Well, can I just say that this seems to be what the Lord intends, because, of course, the clergy should be doing it. Of course, the bishops and the parish priests should be doing it, but it's not their fault. We live in a time of cancellation, and it just so happens. I mean, one of the greatest complexities of the moment is the present pontificate and what we make of it. But we know. I was having some very interesting conversation with the English bishops until there was an ad limina in about 2020, I think, and all the English bishops came back and they were beaten people. They'd been read the Riot Act in Rome, and every one of them's kept their head down and their mouth shut ever since. Now, I don't know what was said to them, but it would only need to be an invocation of obedience. They have to be obedient. Of course they do. As their clergy have to be obedient to them. And so one of the great virtues of Catholicism, which is obedience and humility, I'm a great lover of Padre Pio, and I'm very moved by the fact that he never rebelled against the mistreatment of his life from the center, the lies that were told about him, the traps that were set for him, the political machinations that were made against him. And indeed, he asked people not to do anything on his behalf, but he accepted it as suffering. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm not ordained, although that was the original intention and offer. But circumstances changed, and what's changed was the way in which Pope Francis began to tighten the screws, so that people who spoke out found themselves in enormously difficult positions. And like Padre Pio, I believe that humility and submission uh, are enormously important. And if I'd been a priest, I wouldn't speak out if I was told not to. But I'm not a priest, and so I can speak out, and I can take the heat off to some extent some of the people who would want to speak out. So in a way, this is not an act of self-aggrandizement. It's partly also designed to protect the clergy. We desperately need our priests to be there to celebrate the Mass for us, and we don't need them cancelled or discarded in any way. And so, and it was Sheen who forced, dear Sheen, who also had a very complicated life politically, with his best friend and a patron turning against him. Sheen said, there's going to be a time when the laity are going to have to speak out to do this particular apologetic job. So that's the time. This is the time.
Yeah. It's occurred to me when I read Jeremiah particularly, and then you read parts of Jesus in the Gospels, where they don't shy away from condemning the religious authorities, not even the behavior. The authorities themselves whitewash tombs. So they were able to do that in their day, but in our day, we're told that if we even go anywhere near that kind of criticism of the corruption that we see, we're being disobedient, bad Catholics.
Absolutely.
What's happened to our heads to make us think that we have to remain silent and complicit, basically, in the face of wicked behavior?
I think it's a matter of fear and lack of common sense. I mean, so 2 days ago, there's a lovely elderly Polish Catholic woman I love and respect, and she wrote to me and said, "I'm absolutely disgusted with you that you're attacking the church." And I had done a video on what was it? Because it was actually on the British riots. And what she took as attacking the church was at the very end simply saying it was a duty of Catholic spokespeople to speak up for freedom of speech and for justice to the British state, which it is. And I wrote back to her and said, "I'm not attacking the church at all. I'm defending the church." No. If you're rude about clergy, you're attacking the church. And I said, well, but the thing is, if you love the church, and for one reason or another, it's going wrong, everything depends upon your attitude. If you're pointing the finger and saying, "I'm better than you," and you're dreadful people, then you might, or you're doing something that denigrates the office in any kind of way, then I think she'd be right. But I believe I take great care not to do that. I'm very sympathetic to the office. I'm sympathetic to the people who hold the office. And it just so happens that we live in very difficult times where there's an enormous amount of groupthink. It's so much of what Orwell wrote about is becoming tangibly real. And this, it's this groupthink that led to COVID compliance and the lack of our human rights, and it's this groupthink that's leading us to accept thought crime of all things, so that people can be arrested for standing on the pavement by a buffer zone in an abortion clinic, neither saying nor doing anything, and being asked by the police what they're doing in their heads. We mustn't give in to this groupthink, and so it seems to me that one of the things that perhaps people like me can do is to go on telling as much of the truth in a spirit of charity and non-condemnation of people, but absolutely condemnation of ideas and heresies and of evil. But there's a distinction to be made. And I think that probably my dear elderly Polish friend, partly from the pressure of groupthink and partly perhaps because she's more pious than she is thoughtful, can't see the difference.
You've mentioned a bit of the situation in England, and I think the only people who can kind of see what's going on are those who are on Twitter. But
Yes, yes,
it might be hyperbole, but it seems to me that the UK is actually descending into tyranny, and the
yes.
reason I say that is, for those who don't know, they're actually emptying the prisons of violent criminals to put people in who are protesting peacefully in the street and posting social media content that's deemed um, offensive by the constabulary, and locked up for years, like 2 years. A guy got 2 years.
Yeah.
Um, anyway, I thought I'd better leave it to a native to explain the situation to people.
One of the interesting things that happened around about 2005 was that I had an intuitive sense of what was coming. So I'd spent the 1980s smuggling Bibles into the Soviet Union. And I tell this again, not as an act of self aggrandizement, but because I got to know Soviet Marxism quite well. I was arrested by the KGB. I visited underground Christians, both Orthodox and Catholic, and it gave me a profound encounter with this awful thing. And I think it's probably not wrong to occasionally, as St. Ignatius might, to discern the spirits. Because about 2005, I suddenly tasted something in my mouth. It was kind of orange and rusty, I remember, and thinking, oh my goodness, this is the spirit that I encountered in the Soviet Union. What's it doing back? And when the wall came down in 1989, along with Fukuyama, I was convinced that the history as we'd known it in the 20th century had ended. We couldn't have been more wrong. But I was so disturbed by this intuitive sense. I began to read, and I then discovered the Frankfurt School, and I had a number of Islamic colleagues. I taught Islam to some extent in a course of monotheistic mysticism for postgraduates, and I began to discover what the Islamic intention for our country and immigration was, and I began to discover the implications of free speech, of the cultural Marxism that the Frankfurt School had played a part in. And so it became quite clear to me, really, fairly early on. I was in a privileged position at this very radical university, because this was the kind of the bowsprit of the whole enterprise. It wasn't that I was being particularly perceptive, but it became very clear to me that we would succumb to authoritarian leftism of wokery. And then after that, Islam would take over. And I pitched it. I reckoned I remember saying, between 2025 and 2030, we'll have an authoritarian left-wing government of a rather brutal kind. And after 2030, 32, Islam will partition the country into Islamic and non-Islamic areas because of the demographics of the major cities. And as it happens, that's exactly what's happening. And so I'm not at all surprised that Starmer should so quickly reach for the toolkit of Marxist authoritarian totalitarianism. These are the first steps. There's no reason to believe there won't be other steps to follow. All we can do is raise our voices and protest, but I suspect that isn't going to be enough. And I'm afraid, well, it's just going to get worse. There was a point when I was in the House of Lords, about 10 years ago, and one of the peers there, who's still there now, said to me, Gavin, when are we going to have civil war? And I said, I don't know, but the sooner the better. Why? Why? He said, why is sooner the better? And I said, well, because there will be civil war. Indeed, it will be civil disturbance that will bring about the Lebanization, the partition of England between Islamic and non-Islamic states. I mean, it's not going to happen, as a matter of voluntary reordering of constitutional allegiances. It's going to happen from a crisis. But I said the sooner it happens, the more of England we can keep as non-Islamic. And the later it happens, the more of England will become Islamic, because there'll be more of them and they'll be stronger and we'll be weaker. So I said, we're in this dreadful position of knowing there'll be civil war and hoping it'll happen sooner rather than later. I was astonished when the riots took place in Southport, but I'm pretty sure that the Labour government are thinking along the same lines. And that's one of the reasons why they allow stabbings and muggings and drug use and anarchy in the Notting Hill Carnival, where the police do almost nothing, and they lock people away for 2 or 3 years for pushing a wheelie bin at the police and falling over while you're doing it, or putting a St George's flag on Facebook. We're already, they're clearly very frightened of a popular uprising, and so they should be. So, if you don't mind my saying, I rather hope there is one. I rather hope it comes sooner rather than later. It's not my job to foment civil unrest, uh, and it's not my job to call for it. But you won't be surprised if, having made this diagnosis, I see it as being a terrible thing that would be better happening sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because you've got a moderate voice, and I'm hearing people that have always been considered rather moderate, or at least they speak moderately, saying the same things. Whether it's in the United States now,
Yes, yes,
other
well, absolutely.
commentators, everyone sees it's coming, but the mainstream media tries to keep everything in denial.
Well, the mainstream medium is doing exactly that. But you're right. I mean, in the United States, well, whatever happens after the election, the other side won't accept it. So if Trump wins, Antifa will be on the streets within seconds, causing the most terrible trouble, and they'll be what they then claim and have provoked as a kind of fascistic crackdown from the federal government. What else can it do in the face of anarchy? And if Harris wins, I'm one of those people who watched the previous election and saw the votes being stolen. I mean, it wasn't just a matter of postal fraud, of which was off the scale, but it was also a matter of turning all the technology off, and when you turned it back on again, things had happened that were completely incompatible with the situation before you turned it off. So it was stolen once. If Harris wins, it's because it was stolen again. And then what will the non-left people do? They'll be very cross, and they should be cross. So either way, America is in for a very, very tough time this autumn. England is in for a very tough time as we come. We're about to hit a period of lamentable and disastrous civil disturbance. But at the heart of it all is a fight for our civil liberties. Firstly, against essentially communism. The utopianism of the left. And secondly, against Islam, which is never friendly when it's in power. So we're right at the end of civilization, and it's going. I suspect that the period we're talking in now is a bit like the phony war in 1939. War's been declared. No one's bombing anyone else. We know it's coming, but it's all rather quiet. But dear heavens, it's going to unleash itself quite soon.
Yeah. If you were to talk about taking sides, we kind of know where the Anglican Church would go, and the Catholic Church, at least in terms of its hierarchy and lay bureaucracy, seems to have become an organ of late liberalism, you might say. You only need to think of the kind of nods to the vaccine mandates and the sympathy for the rainbow agenda and the support for green policies which punish the poor.
Yeah.
But what can the faithful do amidst this when the church is apparently surrendering itself to the world, and it leaves the sheep very vulnerable and alone?
Well, I think it's no accident I found myself carrying theology books into Prague in 1985, because what had happened there was that the particular form of state repression against the Catholic Church, the form that it took, was simply to refuse ordinations, to outlaw them. So the government simply said to bishops, "You'll go to prison if you ordain people." So there weren't any ordinations. What actually happened was they took them underground. Some bishops ordained, some seminarians in secret. And one of the things I was doing was carrying in theological books to their training, because they couldn't get access to any books, of course. They were all... we went in and we were told in any group of 5 people, 3 of them are on the state payroll as informants, and you never know who they are. So you need to conduct yourself in that way. However, And so this underground church took place with masses celebrated by priests ordained secretly, celebrated secretly. And in one sense, that gives me the sense that, well, okay, this isn't the first time the church goes underground. I think Rod Dreher has been very helpful in this. Some people see him as being defeatist, but what he's really said is, you've lost the public battle, you can't reclaim it. Turn your energies into making Catholic networks, Catholic communities, where you can at least recognize each other, be in touch with each other, facilitate each other, where you can find a Catholic lawyer, a Catholic doctor, a Catholic mechanic, a Catholic plumber, where you can look after each other rather than be cancelled because you don't have enough social credit, which is obviously, the Chinese social credit system is obviously going to be brought in. We're going to find ourselves, in the Soviet Union, along with Bibles, I took in medicine, because if you were a believer, you didn't get to consult the state doctor. So, that's coming here too, of course. So the first thing I think is that Catholic laity can reorganize themselves. In France, one of the things that they're doing is they're moving to kind of market cathedral towns where there'll be more Catholics than anybody else, because and therefore that will offer some immunity against the corruption of the state. Catholic groups are doing it in England. People are moving into the same streets and the same areas of churches where they know the priests are sympathetic, and preparing for a catacomb existence where they can educate their own children and look after each other. I think that's the first thing we have to do. We have to make sure that if ever we get cut off from the internet, we have on paper the addresses and telephone numbers of our friends, so because we will be cut off the internet, and so that those practical things. Can the hierarchy do anything? No, I don't think they can, poor dears. I think we're entering a period of persecution and purgation. I don't say that with any kind of frisson of romantic masochism. There's nothing we can do about it. God's given us the responsibility of, if you like, being guards, rear guard for his church as the West enters a period of darkness. It's not our fault it did it. Most of us have tried extremely hard to slow it down or to stop it's not our fault. We've just got the responsibility of honoring Our Lady, defending the Blessed Sacrament, being faithful to the magisterium of the Church. And in a sense, again, one of the reasons why the Pope didn't cause me too much trouble was because most of the Orthodox clergy in the Soviet Union, from Stalin to 1989, were KGB plants. There were very few senior hierarchs who weren't planted there by the state, and so you had to get used to the idea that the state was going to corrupt the hierarchy. That didn't deauthenticate the office of the hierarchy. It just meant you had to be very careful whom you listened to and trusted. And as it happens, I think that our present Holy Father has been metaphysically turned. And so what do the laity do? Well, we pray for a good Pope next time round. We pray for a holy conclave. We pray that the Lord will, through our penitence and obedience, give us some of the things we need to flourish and survive. So prayer, humility, and obedience, and then the courage to put up with whatever we have to go through.
Yeah. Just one more question, I suppose, on the present cultural moment, which is, again, this is videos I've seen from England, but the same laws have been passed in Australia and other Western countries, which are exclusion zones around abortuaries, to the point where the police are coming up and saying, "What are you thinking? Are you praying?" Now, because you were saying with the recusant Catholics that they would get massive fines and whatnot. Well, it's a similar situation now with big fines and potentially jail time for those who used to do that ministry, and there are still some that bravely do it. But it has tended to be families, mothers and fathers and children who have manned the sidewalks. But they're now in a situation where their whole family life would get turned upside down if they were to be jailed or whatnot. So I was thinking, is it potentially a chance for the clergy to step up, particularly high profile clergy, where the police would think twice about arresting a bishop for praying silently outside an abortion clinic? Is it time for some civil disobedience to be shown by our leaders to kind of uh, give some courage to us?
Well, when I was an Anglican continuing bishop, one of my parishes was in the Isle of Man, and they said, we're going to stage a small demonstration outside the abortion clinic. Would you come? So the nice thing about Anglican bishops is they're very purple. I had a very purple cassock. I said, of course I'll come. So in my, looking fairly dramatic, I lent a degree of colour, at the very least, to the demonstration, and I was happy to do it. And I would have been, if I'd been arrested, I'd been sorry if people had got arrested without my being there and my sharing it with them. So my own response when I was a bishop was, yes, of course, and yes, I'd like to see all the bishops of the Catholic Church in England and Wales outside abortion zones in their cassocks and with their purple cinctures. Yes, of course. Why would they not do that? I mean, they who knows if they're breaking the law or not, because the law is a thought crime law. They don't have to answer. One of the things you don't have to do is you don't have to answer questions that the police ask you. So it would be great if they come up and they'd say, we want to know what you're thinking inside your head, and you say no comment. And if they take you to the police station, you say no comment. One of the things that the way police decide to charge you is there's a camera in the interviewing room, and the interview goes to the Crown Prosecution Service, and depending on what you've said, they decide to take you to prosecute in the court. If you say nothing at all, you make it very difficult for them. But if they're accusing you of thought crime, why not say nothing? So I think for the moment we'd be entitled to use the loopholes in the law to make our point. But what is the point really? Is it political or is it spiritual? I think one of the points of praying with a rosary near the clinic is not because we're trying to change the state's mind or feminists' mind, but because the demons don't like it, and because it's a spiritual thing. So it's partly demonstration, but it's mainly an act of pneumatic witness, and also because the Holy Spirit takes disturbed, desperate women and prompts them to talk to someone with a friendly face, to say, and the conversations then take place, initiated by them. So, yes, there are political. As a man, there are political things I'd like to do. I like using, I'm prone to using masculine force, but life in the spirit is sometimes more subtle than that, and one sometimes has to rethink one's masculine immediate response and think of something more pneumatically powerful. But certainly, one of the articles I wrote recently was, how was it that all the justice and peace theologians were always big on looking after the poor in South America when the government was right of centre? But now, when the poor in England are being dispossessed and trashed by their own authorities, why is there no sense that Catholic commitment to justice and peace means you stand with the dispossessed white poor here? There's not even an instinctive recognition they should do that, which makes me feel that the whole thing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s was as we thought it was, a form of politicization hiding behind spirituality. Well, be that as it may, there's plenty of space for, absolutely for standing up for free speech against this attempt by the state to do it. All bishops should be on Twitter. Why? Because Twitter's become the new Samizdat. Twitter is the only place where you can find things out, where you can make allegiances, where you can know things. It's a miracle that happened quite recently, and I dare say prayer had a lot to do with it. But it is a miracle, and we should be making use of it. It's a great form of evangelization if you have people following you who don't know about some of the miracles that are taking place. So for the moment, we should all be on Twitter making the most of it. And it would be really quite useful if some clergy and some members of the hierarchy in judiciously targeted ways were able to lend the weight of their office to defending our civilization, which is Christian at root.
One final question, still on the social media, is you have a Facebook page, and you live stream the Divine Office for those who would like to pray in company, as you say.
Yes.
What inspired you to do that, and how important has the office been in terms of your own spiritual life?
So, in about 2016, I was in an Anglican church on Easter Day, and there was a really good evangelical vicar who did a fabulous sermon on the resurrection. And so I stayed behind after the service to talk to the Lord and say, Lord, that was great. Look after this guy. He's gold. He's really, that was just superb. What a joy. And then I got a bit wistful. I said, but Lord, I can do that. And why have you rusticated me? Why have you made me hand in my license? Why is there no church where I can preach the resurrection? This is not good. Why? What are you up to? And then I'm very hesitant to say the Lord spoke to me, because even when he's doing it, you don't know. You don't really know. You just think. But it seemed to me as if he said, "Go and say your prayers online." And I complained, and I said on Facebook, and I said, "But they'll think I'm a Pharisee." That's just what you complained about when people made an excessive display of their own spirituality. Lord, you're asking me to present myself as a Pharisee to people, and I'd rather not do it. And he just said, go and do it. And then he said, go and preach online. And I said, oh, look, Lord, I've only just learned to preach in the Spirit after 40 years. I can read people's eyes. I can leave my script. I can go where your wind blows me. But I can't do it in front of a camera. That's not possible. That would require a degree of trust and reliance on you that I can't do. There was silence. So rather like Abraham, I said, well, look, Lord, there are 42 people in church today. If I do this thing, let's have an agreement. If I get more than 42, because I didn't have a YouTube channel at all, I was starting from scratch. If I have more than 42 people tune in during the week, then I'll take this as you speaking to me. And if I have less, I'm never doing it again. I'm not going near it. So by the end of the week, I put a little homily about the resurrection on, and I think 200 people turned up out of nowhere. I thought, well, that's as big a congregation as I would normally get. That's not bad. So ever since then, with some difficulty, I continued to offer the Divine Office on the internet. All kinds of people are lonely and want to pray and just want a bit of help to pray. I mean, even if you're sleepless in the middle of the night, to have someone reciting the Psalms is with you is a very good thing. And so numbers vary between 10 and 400 tuning in online each day. I do either the Lord's or the Office of Readings and Compline. Why is the office important? Because praying is very difficult indeed. Praying, there's always something in us that wants to flinch away from the presence of God. In one sense, we're all slightly demonized. We're all slightly, hiding in the Garden of Eden. It takes constant determination to face our Lord day by day, hour by hour. And one of the things about the office is that it kind of, it's a way, it's the way, it's the way of doing it. And one of the things that's become more clear to me, I think, is that the Lord likes the Psalms read out loud. There's something about the incarnation means that the physicality of speaking the word out loud has a greater impact. I know there's a story, I think, that someone once, was it Augustine, saw Anselm just moving his lips and muttering, and he was, reading silently in his head. And up until then, people hadn't read silently in their head, and it became a kind of thing. Well, I think one shouldn't read silently in one's head when it comes to liturgy. I think one should do it out loud. It has an effect, a spiritual effect. Even if you're all by yourself, I think the angels I had a very strange experience in this place where I am now, like with this small chapel. And for the first time in my life, I think I encountered angels. One on my left and one on my right behind my shoulders. I couldn't see them, of course. And I went in to do the liturgy here, and this for the first time. And again, I had the impression that one of them said to me, "If you gabble it, we're not going to join in." And so I said, "Well, I'll slow down then." And since then, I've tried to pray the Psalms out loud slowly, on the grounds I hope the angels would join in. I think this is a corporate mystical act that the kingdom of heaven likes, and it's a kind of de minimis, because if you pray the rosary or you pray the office, you are actually doing it. Whereas when you pray in your head, it's only seconds before a bad wind distracts you, or something absolutely vital you have to do comes and you stop. There aren't so many handholds when you're praying in your head. And praying the office, there's the handhold of the office. And if you're if you're a bit of a weak person, as I'm afraid I am, then I need all the handholds I can get. And I found the office to be a wonderful handhold.
Yeah, we need to sacramentalize our life all over. I say, let's start praying the hours and let's get the church bells back ringing.
Absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah. Gavin, thank you for your time. People who want to follow you some more, if they haven't encountered your channels and whatnot, do you want to give a bit of a promo?
Well, yes, I'm very proud of my colleagues on Catholic Unscripted. It's on YouTube. Please find us there. And I have a webpage, ashenden.org. If you find me on Facebook, you don't have to befriend me, or you can if you want. But if you're a woman, you need to explain why you're doing it. I've so many pretty women who want to befriend me. You'd be really surprised. Approaching me in a state of photographic semi-undress.
All right.
And, well, I can't. I'm assuming they're all. They're all. But anyway, nonetheless, if you do, please just say who you are and why you're doing it. And so the office is on Facebook. I'm on YouTube under my own name. Catholic Unscripted under its own name. Yes, please join the family.
Very good. And for those who are watching us, we're a very young channel. So if you could like, share, and subscribe our content as well, we'd love it. Because that means we can get more people like Gavin on in the future, and they're very enjoyable conversations to have. So I really enjoy it. So please help. All right, Dr. Gavin Ashenden from Normandy in France. Thank you so much for your time.
Mark, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. God bless those who are listening, and I will like and subscribe at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you.